What's up, everybody? Thanks for tuning into this channel. My name is Simon Hill, Black American from Louisiana, coming to you live from Budapest, Hungary. It's about 9:35 p.m. where I'm at right now. Today is February 4th. Happy Black History Month to everybody out there. And we are continuing our Black History Month series by hopefully reading two or maybe even three books this month. This one is Slave Breeding, Sex, Violence, and Memory in African American History by Gregory D. Smithers. This is the ninth book we're reading in our Book to React series. Go check out the other books on the playlist. And I want to apologize to anybody who's confused maybe by the live streams. I'm having some issues with YouTube. I set up one live stream, I press go live, and then I don't go live. So I don't know exactly what's happening on the back end. I mean, this technology is sometimes working with you, sometimes working against you. So apologies to anybody who isn't going to be able to tune in because they're not getting the right notification. Catch this on the playback, watch it on 2X, listen to it while you're doing the dishes, while you're doing laundry, while you're walking your dog, whatever you do when you're listening to this Book to React series. And yeah, so this is part 4 of the series. We're going to be reading chapter 3, Black History and Slave Breeding in the Early 20th Century. I only have about an hour and 20 minutes until I have to go to work. So I'm doing these live streams in between my job, which is as an English teacher. So bear with me. I'm going to be rushing through this chapter 3. And if you're interested in knowing what was in the previous chapters, go watch the previous live streams and let me know what you think in the comment section. Let's go into it. Black History and Slave Breeding in the Early 20th Century. Early 20th century African American scholars added their perspectives on slavery and on slave breeding in particular, at a time when white Americans were in the midst of cultivating an extraordinarily distorted image of antebellum slavery. Margaret Mitchell's Pulitzer Prize-winning novel Gone with the Wind, 1936, and its adaptation into an epic movie of the same title in 1939 embodied the sanitized version of slavery that dominated American popular history and memory prior to World War II. The image of the slave South portrayed in Gone with the Wind proved a neat cultural fit with the historical conceit of cause mythology, a conceit built on conveniently selective lapses in white memories of life in the antebellum South. Adding to the nation's historical amnesia were those self-righteous late 19th and early 20th century historians who insisted that their data sets simply made it impossible to believe that slave breeding had been real or that slavery had been anything other than a school for the Negro. I have to say this, I've been wanting to watch Gone with the Wind for the longest since I started the movie reviews with my wife. We might do Gone with the Wind. I don't think it would be appropriate for Black History Month, but we might do it. No historian did more to validate the benevolent image of the slave South than Ulrich Bonner Phillips. Born in 1877, Phillips received his PhD in history from Columbia University in 1902, having worked under the direction of William A. Dunning. Phillips went on to have a highly successful academic career. Building on his famous advisor's work, Phillips portrayed slavery as a benign labor system in which slaves worked for kindly, if at times stern, owners and overseers. In his most famous study, American Negro Slavery, in 1918, Phillips argued that racial antipathy was, in the South, mitigated by the sympathetic tie of slavery, which promoted an attitude of amiable patronage, even toward the freedmen and their descendants. Phillips had read accounts about the more sinister side of slavery, but these dark tales he chalked up to abolitionist propaganda. Slave breeding was perhaps the most lurid example of abolitionist propaganda to endure in American historical imagination, he believed. While Phillips admitted that overseers were instructed to treat breeding wenches with a kind and indulgent manner, no rational economic motive existed for slave breeding. According to Phillips, even if masters had stimulated breeding on occasion, that would have created but a partial and one-sided relationship between cost of production and market price. To make the connection complete, it would have been requisite for them to check slave breeding when prices were low. Phillips believed that slave breeding had little historical significance. He concluded American Negro slavery by observing there were injustices in Southern slavery, oppression, brutality, and heartburning in the regime. But where in the struggling world are these absent? There were also gentleness, kind-hearted friendship, and mutual loyalty to a degree hard for him to believe, who regards the system with a theorist's eye and a partisan squint. That's just disgusting. He's clouding, the truth about slavery with flowery language right there. And this is no different than what people say today when they say, oh, Jim Crow wasn't that bad. Luckily, right now, so much education has been done that I believe, in fact, I would hope that most people would think that slavery was actually as brutal as the people who went through it said it was. But unfortunately, there still is a lot of this revisionist history when it comes to slavery. Let's continue here. Phillips's history was apparently free from theory-driven scholarship and the politically motivated histories that Black historians produced. He would no doubt have disapproved of W.B. Du Bois's review of American Negro slavery. Du Bois criticized Phillips' casual dismissal of slave breeding schemes, insisting, contrary to Phillips' assertions, that American slavery as an institution was at best a mistake and at worst a crime. Du Bois concluded the mere fact that slavery left to the world today a heritage of ignorance, crime, lynching, lawlessness, and economic injustice to be struggled with by this and succeeding generations is a condemnation by Mr. Phillips and unanswerable. Such reviews spoke to the absence of human feeling and empirical histories about slavery and its legacies, issues that did not interest Phillips. He, after all, produced history, giving American facts about the past. And the fact was, according to Phillips, that slave breeding had never happened. What then did happen? How could the increase in the Negro population, he explained, especially increases in the mulatto population? According to Phillips and historians of his generation, such as Claude G. Bowers, the rise in African American and mixed race population resulted from the sexual immorality and promiscuity of Black women. Disgusting. Absolutely disgusting that somebody would even make that assertion. Bowers argued in 1929 that a whole race of Black whores had given birth to a new nation during the Civil War and Reconstruction. I'm disgusted by what I'm reading. Bowers drew on white eyewitnesses' reports, which claimed that Negro girls for miles around are gathered to the camps of Union soldiers and debauched. Analysis of this type highlighted how historical works on slavery overlapped with late 19th and early 20th century anxieties about the racial destiny of white America. Bowers voiced popularly held white male anxieties about the loss of racial control and power that white patriarchs had enjoyed during slavery. These patriarchs had been noble men driven by their patriarchal responsibilities to protect and care for their slaves. Freed from such protection and from the master's disciplinary restraints, former slaves, especially women, surrendered to their animalistic sexual nature and produced a new nation of unwanted mulattoes. This was the scholarly context in which African American academics worked to craft their own analysis of slavery. Unlike their white academic counterparts, early 20th century Black historians showed an acute awareness of the legacy of slavery in African American life and culture. In an era when the phrase Negro problem complemented lost cause mythology by focusing on Black Americans as a sociological problem in American life, Black intellectuals struggled to have their voices heard, much less their findings taken seriously by the white intellectual establishment that dominated discussions of history and contemporary race relations. It was in this cauldron of racial hostility that Black intellectualism, in particular professional African American history writing, emerged. At the beginning of the 20th century, there existed two broad types of Black historical writing. One category consisted of self-taught African American historians. These writers generally focused on the contributions that people of African descent had made over several millennia to the building of civilization. From the construction of Egypt's pyramids to the building of America, the African race had been integral to the rise of civilization. The other category of Black historians was a small group of professionally trained scholars. Most were men who had received doctorates in history and were supportive of programs for racial uplift. The histories that these scholars produced were not simply contributionist studies designed to vindicate the African American contribution to the building of the American Republic. They were deeply analytical in nature and contributed to a broader professional discourse about the meaning of American history. For professional Black historians, one could not seriously contribute to a scholarly understanding of American history without exploring the depths of slavery's inhumanity and analyzing its legacy. Originally, for this live stream, I wanted to put up a poll where people were able to vote who is the greatest Black historian, and I had W.B. Du Bois, Carter G. Woodson, Ivan Van Sertima, and John Henrik Clarke. And I believe the first two, Carter G. Woodson and W.B. Du Bois, fall more into that traditional historian camp, and Ivan V. Sertima and John Henrik Clarke fall more into that amateurish, though I know John Henrik Clarke was a teacher and Ivan Van Sertima was a teacher as well. And I both give respect to both of them. I'm not one of those people that say you need to be a professional historian or that, only the street or amateur historians are the only ones who are reputable. No, I believe we should honor all of our ancestors and all of our intellectuals and historians. But I wanted to put up that poll, but unfortunately YouTube wasn't working with me. Hopefully I can do it tomorrow. So this chapter focuses on the professional class of Black scholars and writers of history during the early 20th century. Faced with a hostile academic culture, Black intellectuals were nonetheless determined to present their own historical interpretations of slavery. For the most part, these studies resulted from the labors of African American men. African American women were virtually locked out of higher education, most confined to an education that men, both Black and white, deemed appropriate to the feminized professions, such as nursing and social work. However, some Black women did receive doctorates in history prior to World War II. Anna Julia Cooper from the University of Paris in 1925, and Marion Thompson Wright from Columbia University in 1940 being two prominent examples. Nonetheless, the dominant Black voices in African American historical and scholarly writing prior to World War II were those of men. The following analysis focuses on three of the most influential of these voices: W.B. Du Bois, Carter G. Woodson, and E. Franklin Frazier. While there exist many fine biographies of these men, we still know relatively little about how these scholars incorporated the controversial topic of slave breeding into their analyses of slavery. This chapter therefore explores how Du Bois, Woodson, and Frazier combined empirical data with their analysis of the sensational claims of slave breeding issued by abolitionists and amateur historians during the 19th and early 20th centuries, and how they set out to highlight what they felt were the inadequacies of the mainstream historical profession. The result was a very different perspective on slavery and its legacy. Evidence, history, and meaning. All published works of history are the products of the author's selection and or discarding of evidence, framing that evidence to fit a larger narrative, and then editing, often many times, the piece of historical writing before it is published. This is as true today as it was in the 4 decades before World War II. No group of American intellectuals understood the selectivity of historical writing more acutely than Black scholars. When it came to writing the history of slavery in the United States, many Black academics felt there was too much excising and finessing of evidence going on among their white counterparts. I would like to know what y'all think about all this. So remember, I'm in the chat, and we're live now. So let me know what you think about this book. Don't be quiet out there. But yeah, continuing here, shout out once again to all the historians and the people that came before that were fighting against this hostile academic world that was mostly all white, and academia is still all white. And I'm a Black person who's hoping to get into academia in the future. I don't know if it'll be 10 years from now, 15, 20, who knows, but I hope to do that in my life. It's not easy being a Black person and an intellectual. Writing in the Journal of Negro History in 1940, Herman Dreer attempted to expose the objective historian's evidentiary sleights of hand. In a sustained critique of the American historical profession and the textbooks scholars had produced for history teachers, Dreer was direct and forthright in his criticism. He observed that white scholars presented the Negro to students as a servant and little else. Dreer complained that the innocent teacher would be mistaken for thinking that people of African descent played no role in ancient, medieval, and modern history if they relied on textbooks written by America's leading professional historians. For example, Dreer contended that A.E. McKinley and A.C. Howard's World History in the Making taught students nothing of the demoralizing of the Negro by 250 years of broken and immoral family life. Dreer added that the innocent instructor teaches that the Negro as a slave picked cotton and had a good time singing and dancing. He says nothing of the brutal beatings and nauseating slave breeding. The innocent teacher conveys the impression that the Negro readily submitted to slavery. Dreer, like most other African American intellectuals, was unwilling to sit idly by as prejudiced or cowardly white historians misrepresented Black history. These historians also refused to allow the institutional and individual forms of oppression meted out to African American people for generations to remain uncontested. Black scholars expressed a variety of views on slavery and expressed differences of opinion over whether to cultivate a separatist identity or take a more integrationist approach to racial politics. All agreed, however, that enslavement was a severe form of dehumanization that had an enduring impact on people. Harvard University's first African American graduate, Richard T. Greener, spoke for many Black Americans when he said of slavery's legacy among African Americans, "The Negro has no tears to shed over that wonderful school of slavery under Providence, so often quoted." Absolutely a shame, but that goes to show, man, like, people will do anything to rewrite history. If history wasn't important, why do people want to fight to tell it or fight to change it? What Greener was alluding to here was the idea that slavery had an enduring impact on the lives and historical memories of African Americans. Implicit was an understanding of America's past in which Black Americans recognized the root cause of their socioeconomic marginalization, and in which white racism distorted historical representations of slavery. White intellectuals framed such matters very differently, preferring to refer to the plight of African Americans as the Negro problem. The Negro problem had become a fixture in the Negro problem had become a fixture in American popular culture and scholarly discourse by the early 20th century. It referred to the existence of a Black population that occupied an economically impoverished, politically disenfranchised, and culturally marginalized status in American society. In the minds of many white Americans, then the abolition of the school of slavery created a problem in America, the Negro problem. So basically what they're saying is, like, when slavery was abolished, then we get the Negro problem. Like, then we get problems with Black folks. Before then, it was great. Very similar to what we studied in the book by Martha Hodes in our previous part, right? Before slavery ended, basically, there was a different set of social norms, rules, and understandings. Afterwards, everything was upended and Black people became a target, right? So in 1891, the white politician and Pulitzer Prize-winning author William Cable Bruce referred to the Negro problem at length in his famous book of that title. Bruce emphasized the way in which whites, particularly Southern whites, viewed the Negro problem as a political dilemma that stemmed from Black Americans voting almost uniformly for the Republican Party. Bruce argued. Let me turn on the light because I just realized how dark it is. And I realized I don't have light here. Here we go. That's better. All right, so here we go. So Bruce argued that political uniformity, a product of the Republican Party's association with emancipation, antagonized white Southerners and fueled the racialized nature of the Negro problem. Sounds very similar today. As they say, get off the Democrat plantation. Black people voting in blocks for one party, and that's making things worse for us. Sounds very similar today. The more things change, the more they stay the same. The politics of the Negro problem also affected a slew of social issues, such as race prejudice, amalgamation or race mixing, education, violence, including lynching, race riots, and peonage. These were all issues that could be tied in one form or another to slavery and its legacy. According to Black scholars and civic leaders, the solution to the Negro problem would occur in the developmental stages. Reflecting the era's evolutionary theories of race, African American spokespeople emphasized a variety of strategies, such as industrial development, education, and enfranchisement. Few Black leaders disputed the link between the Negro problem and slavery. As H.T. Keeling argued, the emancipated Negro struggles up to day against many obstacles, the entailment of a brutal slavery. Hubert Harrison, the radical Black socialist leader from Harlem, New York, shared this view, arguing that the caste system in America today is what we roughly refer to as the race problem, and it is thus seen that the Negro problem is essentially an economic problem with its roots in slavery, past and present. For white people, agreeing on a solution to America's Negro problem was far more difficult than acknowledging its roots in slavery. According to some white intellectuals and political leaders, the American Republic did not have the constitutional infrastructure to deal with the legacy of slavery and the Negro problem. This perspective overlooked the role of the federal government in allowing slavery to flourish after the ban of the international slave trade and ultimately its role in abolishing slavery in the 1860s. One scholar wrote, "The revolutionary forefathers, the makers of our Constitution, lived in a very simple world compared to this streamlined age of ours. The Negro problem, then, was not something the federal government had any business trying to remedy. Indeed, the problems facing Black Americans were often assumed to be of their own making, a product of laziness, jealousy of white accomplishments, and an unnecessary morose, sorry, and an unnecessarily morose view of the past. Historians such as Walter Linwood Fleming complain that African American interpretations of slavery were defined by intense racial animosity toward whites and the constant clank of chains and the cutting swish of the lash. Social scientists were adding their insights to this discussion. The sociologist Edward Reuter, for example, sought solutions to the Negro problem, but did so by arguing that since the passing of the 13th Amendment, a long and painful period of blind fumbling for a new basis of racial accommodation had unfolded, making some sort of tolerable working relations between the races seem like a pipe dream. The Swedish social scientist Gunnar Myrdal synthesized late 19th and early 20th century interpretations of this nature. His study of American race relations, An American Dilemma, 1944, emphasized the failure of African American scholars to articulate a solution to the Negro problem. Myrdal argued that the formation of popular theories among Negroes concerning the Negro problem does not result in articulate, systematized, and stable opinions. Black America was thus an intellectually disjointed and culturally vacuous place in which the brutalities of slavery were exaggerated and political solutions to the Negro problem absent. Sounds very similar today to what people say, all y'all do is complain about racism and talk about the past. Y'all need to look forward. And at the same time, they're distorting our past and making it seem like nothing bad ever actually happened. Once again, we have to be very cognizant and we should read these books because everything that people are saying today, get off the Democrat plantation, we don't need to be voting, there's no point in learning about the past. Why even crack open a book? Unfortunately, which you'll hear some Black people say, they tell us not to read. There are people that actively encourage us not to read, not to educate ourselves. It was all said in the past as well. What happens today also happened in the past. History doesn't repeat, but it often rhymes. Continuing here. There were, however, historical explanations for the Negro problem. The Works Progress Administration narratives that scholars began consulting on a regular basis after World War II contained some of these explanations. Prior to World War II, though, African American historians and intellectuals recognized that they were working against an academic establishment that ignored, misrepresented, or downplayed what their research indicated was the enduring legacy of slavery. African American intellectuals dug far deeper than white academics in exploring the history and memory of sexual exploitation, racial violence, and family dislocation in Black America. In the process, they began to lay the intellectual foundations for what became the civil rights movement after World War II. So, slavery and African American scholarly activism. In the halls of academe, Black intellectuals explored those grimmer aspects of American history that white historians found absent in their data sets. African American scholars emphasized the impact that sexual exploitation and racial violence during slavery continued to have on Black life and culture in early 20th century America. The ministers of America's Black churches generally avoided issues like sexuality, violence, and even slavery. If they did speak about such issues, it was indirectly and often within a message of racial uplift. This was the cult of respectability that was so important to the social work and politics of Black women, a politics that instructed Black men and women on their proper roles as husbands, wives, and parents. W.B. Du Bois certainly shared this interest in Black uplift and efforts to counter racist perceptions of Black Americans. He did not, however, turn away from issues of sexuality, violence, and the enduring legacy of slavery. Du Bois was born in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, on February 23rd, 1868. He was a child of the African diaspora, his father, by some accounts, being born in San Domingo, Haiti. Du Bois grew to manhood in an age characterized by the racial uncertainty and violence of post Civil War America. A gifted student, Du Bois found opportunities to succeed in life, earning a PhD in history from Harvard University. His dissertation on the African slave trade was published in 1896 as The Suppression of the African Slave Trade. I did not know that W.B. Du Bois had Haitian roots. Who knew that? Didn't know that. Du Bois's analysis of the international slave trade was a serious challenge to white professional historians determined to focus on the facts of the slave South's political economy. Du Bois was interested in these issues, but he was also concerned with the causes and legacies of the North American slave population's dramatic growth after the international slave trade to the United States was abolished in 1808. Once again, let me just open up the chat and let y'all know that we're here to talk. We're here to discuss these books. And if you have information about these books or anything you want to share, please let us know. All right? But let's go here. Going back to the book, like Henry Clay Bruce, Benjamin Arnett, and myriad other African Americans who addressed the memory of slavery during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Du Bois wrestled with the historical and sociological implications of sexual exploitation and violence in slavery and freedom. In Suppression, though, Du Bois does not take up these issues and the related issue of population increases among slaves in the American South after 1808, as systematically as he would in subsequent work. David Levering Lewis explains this by arguing that Du Bois failed to recognize that most slaves imported from Africa after 1808 found themselves in Brazil or Cuba. As Lewis explains, slaveholders in the American South not only mainly grew their own labor force, they encouraged living conditions that kept their investments alive, generally healthy, and augmenting in value. Southern slaveholders, in other words, did not need the clandestine international trade in African slaves after 1808. They simply bred their own. Du Bois, the scholar and civil rights activist, was deeply troubled by the idea of slave populations being augmented through sexual manipulation. He conceded in Suppression that after 1820, the extension of slavery into the American Southwest led to a dramatic increase in the internal slave trade. This connection between the territorial expansion of slavery and Black reproduction led Du Bois to explain the increasing crop caused a new demand for slaves, and for interstate slave traffic arose between the border and the Gulf states, which turned the former into slave breeding districts and bound them to the slave states by ties of strong economic interest. Shout out to W.B. Du Bois, he a legend. In an 1897 essay, The Conservation of Race, Du Bois tackled the meaning of race and moved toward a more explicit analysis of reproductive manipulation in African American history. He placed his analysis in the context of a growing African American literature that debated the meaning and significance of racial pride, uplift, and the racial destiny of Black people in the United States. Focusing firmly on our future development, Du Bois insisted that the racial destiny of African Americans was not absorption by the white Americans. He went on to insist that it is our duty to conserve our physical powers, our intellectual endowments, our spiritual ideals. The legacy of slavery, the shades of color, and the unstable social lives it created is implicit in this analysis. It is implicit because the overt message is a call to action, a call to Black Americans to draw on their inner strength to combat the legacies of slavery. Like his Black contemporaries, such as Kelly Miller, who argues that the Negroes in this country are a thoroughly mixed people, Du Bois's solutions to what white Americans called the Negro problem did not shy away from the legacy of violence and sexual exploitation that punctuated Black history since slavery. In particular, Du Bois became ever more explicit about the enduring consequences of reproductive manipulation during slavery times. Writing in the Negro American Family, 1908, he cited James C. Ballogg's A History of Virginia to question the profitability of slave breeding. He asserted that if such practices did in fact exist in the slave South, they were likely confined to a certain class. Interestingly, Du Bois had made similar observations about the intersection of race and class in the Philadelphia Negro. During the first decade and a half of the 20th century, Du Bois continued to see the confluence of race and class as crucial to understanding slavery's legacy in American life. In 1908, he posited that the essential feature of Negro slavery in America was no legal marriage, no legal family, no legal control over children. As abolitionists, both black and white and former enslaved insisted these were the three central components of reproductive manipulation in the slave breeding South. So basically, what he's trying to say here is like W.B. Du Bois is saying, like, because the marriages between black people weren't recognized, people could have been sold off. People were also going to cohabitate together. And, people did not have control over their nuclear families if they so happened to want to build them. This is what basically bred black people as well. Of course, there was also, possibly going on, no, more than definitely going on, forced intercourse, essentially rape of women that bred slaves. But this is what he's saying. Given that Du Bois presented such analysis in an era characterized by lost cause mythologizing and a scholarly rewriting of slavery's past place in American history, his conclusions were stark. Indeed, there existed a moral undertone to Du Bois' writing on slavery, a metaphorical finger pointing at those he viewed as responsible for slavery's legacy. The Negro problem. White Americans and the socioeconomic structures they put in place were responsible for the ill effects of slavery's legacy. Drawing on Du Bois's work and that of the Irish abolitionist Daniel O'Connell, Charles Victor Roman, the black physician, said as much when in 1916 he observed, "The breeding of slaves for sale is probably the most immoral and debasing practice ever known to the world. There is no intellectual sophistry here, just a blunt, matter-of-fact statement designed to counter the sentiment distortions of lost cause propaganda." Benjamin Griffith Brawley, the dean of Morehouse College, provided a similarly unvarnished presentation of slavery. Drawing on the travel narratives of Frederick Law Olmsted and Professor Dew's pro-slavery argument, Brawley argued that the territorial expansion of slavery resulted in a growing demand for slaves, a demand that could only be met through slave owners and slave traders' adoption of slave breeding practices. Brawley asserted the legal abolition of the international slave trade coincided with the heavy demands imposed by the Louisiana Purchase and the development of the Lower South. The slave increased in value, and Virginia and Maryland became famous breeding places for the plantations of the far South. A woman who was an extraordinary breeder being advertised as such. Brawley cites an example from Dew's analysis. On remote plantations, the operation of the system was most gross, and a woman separated from her husband was forced to accept a new mate. Brawley and Du Bois lived for a time in the same city, Atlanta, and read each other's work. Du Bois actually recommended Brawley's Short History of the American Negro to a German law student in the early 20th century. The two men shared a harsh view of the internal workings of the slave South, a view that was out of step with that of the white historical establishment. In Black America, Du Bois's unvarnished representations of slavery met with a receptive audience. As his work evolved, his critique of slavery and its legacy became even more pointed. In fact, Du Bois found it difficult on occasion to hide his contempt for white historical writing. He lambasted U.B. Phillips' influential American Negro Slavery, for example, referring to it as curiously incomplete and unfortunately biased. For the best part of 2 decades, Du Bois had been trying to undermine such biased history writing. By the 1920s, his commitments to such endeavors was as unwavering as ever. Shout out to W.B. Du Bois, fighting. Remember, we're in an intellectual war. We are in an intellectual war with white supremacy. Building on his magisterial The Souls of Black Folks in 1903, a searing treatment of Black culture, identity, and American race relations, Du Bois published one of the greatest scholarly essays of the early 20th century, The Damnation of Women. Du Bois's essay appeared in his book, Dark Water, in which he wrestled with the issues of slavery and segregation, sex and marriage, femininity, and motherhood. The essay is most often remembered for the clarity of its feminist vision and Du Bois's exposure of American hypocrisy on the issue of womanhood. Americans, Du Bois observed, worship both virgins and mothers, and in the end despise the mother and despoils the virgins. Such was the case, Du Bois contended, for Black women. With the history of slavery looming large in his analysis, Du Bois described America's darker sisters as both the daughters of sorrow and the primal black all mother of men, and the primal black all mother of men. From dusky Cleopatras to Sojourner Truth, Du Bois insisted that despite her curious history, her slavery, polygamy, and toil, the spell of the African mother pervades her land. African American women and black motherhood were forced to endure the crushing weight of slavery, but their strength, Du Bois insisted, enabled them to endure the exploitation of the swaggering masters. Their strengths also helped to lay the foundations of the great Negro church of today and to struggle against economic and social adversity to keep Black families together. In his evocative and moving conclusion, Du Bois reiterated the awe in which he held Black women and Black mothers. No other woman on earth, he wrote, could have emerged from the hell of force which once engulfed and still surrounds Black women in America with half the modesty and womanliness that they retain. Shout out to W.D. Du Bois. He loved his sisters. He's a Black queen. She's a Black queen, mama. Feminist scholars have observed that Du Bois grounded his discussions of Black sexuality, particularly Black female sexuality, in slavery. This is important because Black religious and political leaders attempted to combat sexual and racial stereotypes with sermons and speeches that echoed the tenets of the cult of respectability. Black women, such as the professional historian Anna Julia Cooper, also elaborated on the ideal enshrined in the culture of respectability. They did so not because of an aversion to discussing racism and sexism, though for a significant number of Black women, a disinclination to publicly discuss such matters was an issue, but because they recognized that the cult of true womanhood, an ideal used in white America to prescribe a woman's place as being in the home, did not fit the reality of most Black women. Cooper was well qualified as any professional historian, Black or white, male or female, to make such claims. She knew that the legacy of slavery continued to press on the daily lives of Black women. In slavery, Cooper's grandmother recalled the shame of giving birth to a child conceived when her master raped her. In the early 20th century, Black women continued to encounter such violence in work environments, particularly those who worked as domestics. Du Bois understood the gender dimensions of slavery's legacy. It was why he felt compelled to celebrate the strength of Black women and support them in espousing the politics of respectability. The politics of respectability was the most public way in which African Americans responded to the legacy of slavery, or what whites termed the Negro problem. In the hands of Black men, the politics of respectability involved a masculine determination to protect Black women from rape, physical abuse, and economic poverty. While some African Americans, particularly Black church ministers, tried not to place too much emphasis on sex and slavery, it was difficult to escape the links between the politics of respectability and slavery's memory. Du Bois's politics of respectability was also characterized by a protective masculine pose denied to men during slavery, and bitterly with the emergence of those racially discriminatory laws, political practices, and social conventions associated with Jim Crow segregation after the 1890s. Perhaps this was why in a 1928 essay, Du Bois made explicit the link between slavery and the supreme bugaboo of early 20th century America, miscegenation. The intermingling of blood that Du Bois identified as a fact of life in the slave South had left an enduring biological legacy in the American population. According to Du Bois, the so-called American Negro is probably less than 25% of pure African. And since most of the intermingling of blood took place during slavery, not during the Civil War and Reconstruction era, as white historians argued, the racially mixed nature of the American population was a living embodiment of the rape, violence, and sexual exploitation that Black Americans associated with slavery. The intermingling of blood and the presence of the mulatto in American society reminded African Americans how they, or their ancestors, had once been exposed to vile slave breeding schemes. By the 1930s, Du Bois understood that the legacy and memory of slavery continued to affect Black men, women, and families in ways that white Americans could never fully comprehend. Equipped with this understanding of slavery's ongoing impact on the lives of African Americans, Du Bois drew the attention of readers of the crisis to the population growth of the Negro in the United States. In the February 1933 edition, Du Bois wrote that the growth of the Negro population in the United States had been an astonishing phenomenon, especially when we remember that in 1790, when there were only three-fourths of a million Negroes in the country, it was the generally accepted fact that without a slave trade, Negroes could not survive. What happened is that slaves without a slave trade became more valuable. With cotton culture, their values rose still further. So that they were fed adequately and their breeding systematically encouraged. There were explosive charges. Du Bois, however, had already leveled these allegations against the slave South. Just 3 years before his editorial in the Crisis, Du Bois, ever the vigilant social scientist, used census data to show the consistent increases in the African American population following the close of the international slave trade. According to Du Bois, hypocritical America may recreate a more sanitized version of its history, but the struggles for Black women, the fragility of Black families, and white America's obsession with miscegenation did not emerge sui generis after the Civil War. It had its origin. It had its origins in slavery and the exploitative practices that slave owners and slave traders implemented. In Du Bois's words, these emancipated slaves were victims who had been bred deliberately in sloth, ignorance, poverty, and crime. Their emancipation meant that they must either be killed off, gotten rid of by compulsory migration, or that they must be educated and trained. Poverty, sexual exploitation, race prejudice, and violence all had their roots in slavery, according to Du Bois. He insisted that the Negro intelligentsia had an important role to play in helping Black Americans overcome the legacy of slavery without the legacy of slavery. Sorry, Black Americans overcome the legacy of slavery. Black scholars, Du Bois maintained, must encourage economic uplift, political equality, and acculturation, which he defined as the elevation of African Americans from their low cultural station. Very interesting. Very interesting. A lot of stuff here about Du Bois. Okay. All right, quite a few pages. I don't even know if I'll have time to get to it. Hold on. Where were we? Maybe I'm actually not that far. Okay. All right. All right. These were explosive charges. Du Bois, however, had already leveled in his allegation against the slave South. Just 3 years before his editorial in the Crisis, Du Bois, ever the vigilant social scientist, used census data to show the consistent increase in African American population. Okay. All right, low cultural station. Yeah, we already did that. But as Du Bois observed in his masterwork, Black Reconstruction in America, 1935, overcoming the legacy of slavery and engendering racial uplift would not be a simple task. Black Reconstruction was a direct challenge to the Dunning-Phillips School of Historical Interpretation, meticulous in its scholarship, clear and uncompromising in its analysis. The book exposed the enduring legacy that slavery and slave breeding had on Black Americans and their families. Du Bois reiterated his earlier claims about the Upper South breeding slaves for the Lower South. His analysis, though, went deeper than it had gone before in exploring the historical significance of slave breeding. Highlighting the economic value that slave owners and traders placed on breeding, Du Bois noted that while the African American population increased during slavery, the sale of children shattered families, and he observed a breeding woman is worth 1/6 to 1/4 more than one that does not breed. So, according to Du Bois, slave breeding violated enslaved women, forced slave men to act as studs, and destroyed families. The impact of slave breeding on Black America was sexual chaos, the product of economic motives. Du Bois elaborated on these assertions, arguing the deliberate breeding of a strong, big field hand stock could be carried out by selecting proper males and giving them the run of the likeliest females. This, in many border states, became a regular policy and fed the slave trade. Brian C says, Good morning. Good morning to you, Brian C., wherever you are. It's not morning over here. It's late. It's nighttime. All right. So yeah, da, 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 da. So childbearing was a profitable occupation, which received many possible encouragement, or which received every possible encouragement, and there was not only no bar to illegitimacy, but an actual premium put upon it. Indeed, the word was impossible. Indeed, the word was impossible of meaning under the slave system. Generations of African Americans were going to live with the memory and legacy of slave breeding. According to Du Bois, the breeding and trade in Black bodies occupied such a central part of Black history that it remained a fundamental narrative structure. For white Americans, however, the tradition of breeding and selling slaves did not merit serious attention. What mattered in white America's master narrative was the history of great men and the study of their ideas and battles. Black men, women, and children were merely cogs in this larger story. Du Bois's analysis looked squarely into the teeth of America's racial history and outlined the cause of the Negro problem. The African American historian Carter G. Woodson shared Du Bois's commitment to understanding the history of slavery and its legacies, where Du Bois insightfully combined historical and social scientific methodologies to analyze slavery's enduring impact on African Americans. Woodson focused on the history of Black America. Woodson, along with contemporaries such as Lorenzo Johnston Green, claimed that they were using scientific method to reconstruct the history of Black America. As Woodson, Green, and other Black historians saw their work, such endeavors involved a life and death struggle to prevent the memory of their African American descendants from slipping into the midst of the past. Woodson's scholarship was brutally insightful and politically blunt in its attempt to keep the memory of Black history alive in the collective consciousness of the American people. Like Du Bois, Woodson excavated antebellum slavery's colonial antecedents and highlighted the trials, tribulations, and accomplishments of African American people in North America. He argued that Northern and Southern whites had imposed immense challenges on Black Americans. While we must feel ashamed, he wrote, of the South for its lingering medievalism inflicted upon the section of chattel slavery, he argued that Black Americans must also hold the Mayflower descendants responsible for accelerating the backward step into darkness, which still overshadows the land of cotton. Although Du Bois was at times critical of Woodson's limited analysis of African American women, Woodson's scholarship was scathing of the way Black women were forced to endure a history of violent sexual exploitation in the United States. From an early period in the English colonization of the northeastern portion of America, Woodson argued that the sexual exploitation of women of African descent explained the origins of miscegenation in the United States. In 1918, he argued in a famous essay, The Beginning of the Miscegenation of the Whites and Blacks, that a combination of legal developers and feelings of shame meant that white men tried to cover up their sexual exploitation of, or in some cases, love affairs with, Black women, lest they incur the sanction of the community and the wrath of the white wives. The political evisceration that Thomas Jefferson endured for his sexual affair with the slave Sally Hemings and his effort to save face was the most famous example of why Woodson and other Black historians placed limited trust in population statistics and the accounts of plantation owners when it came to matters of sexual coercion and miscegenation. In fact, Woodson viewed the contradictory and inaccurate statistics that the pro-slavery propagandists of the 19th century drew from, and which professional historians continue to rely on, with a suspicion bordering on contempt. Woodson's skepticism about the narrow source base that white, predominantly male historians relied upon was evident in his famous The Negro in Our History. This was a major contribution to the Black history movement, not least because Woodson's analysis of slavery and some major contribution to the Black history movement, not because Woodson's analysis of slavery paid significant attention to the sexual exploitation of enslaved women. Woodson argued that because of the closing of the international slave trade, Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina, Kentucky, Tennessee, Missouri, and Delaware became slave breeding states. In language that often Black historians echoed, Woodson argued that to apply the Southwest with laws, the domestic slave trade became an important business, and the other states which suffered from migration devoted themselves to slave breeding for this market. Woodson's emphasis, like that of the antebellum abolitionists before him and the former slaves who testified about slave breeding during the late 1930s, was on the commercial exploitation of slave reproduction. Economic and brutally exploited, thus bled into one another as Woodson portrayed a system in which slaves were reproduced and sold for profit. He continued a line of argument into the 1930s, writing with Charles H. Wesley in 1935. Yeah. Woodson again insisted that there was a regional dimension to the sexual and economic exploitation associated with slave breeding practice. To rehabilitate things, to rehabilitate in the Upper South, they asserted, efforts were made to fertilize the woman. All right, to fertilize the worn out soil. All right, so to rehabilitate things in the South, they asserted, efforts were made to fertilize the worn out soil and temporarily, if apparently succeeded, but more relief came when the planters of those states resorted to slave breeding and used the surplus trade and used their surplus slaves in railroad construction. Like the Lower South in the meantime was apparently in its golden age, as the technology of the railroads, along with canals, constituted the economic region of the slave South. The breeding of enslaved bodies facilitated with the South African government. It facilitated the South Africa's. Sorry, why am I saying South Africa? I'm tripping, man. I'm tired as hell. As the technology of the railroads, along with canals, connected the economic regions of the slave South, the breeding of enslaved bodies facilitated the South's economic growth and became its own technology of power. Okay. Wake up. Okay. Anyway, the sexual exploitation of enslaved women for breeding purposes combined various elements of economic, medical, and disciplinary culture to produce discourse of health and pathology about the Negro in American society. These discourses endured long after slavery was abolished. Woodson recognized this in his most famous work, The Miseducation of the Negro, 1933. In this book, Woodson argued that popular prejudices shaped the analysis of historians of slavery and social scientists when addressing the Negro problem. He contended that white historians were unexamined in their own racism, presenting real history from legal and economic sources that mistakenly portrayed slavery as a school in which the slave toiled happily in good health. White historians used similarly skewed sources to pathologize the emancipated slave as a politically corrupt and sexually deviant in nature. Woodson countered that such portrayals prompted some white scholars to identify Black people as the cause of racial tension in America. These arguments were not only racist, but they were so ridiculously sensational that they inhibited many Americans from attempting to understand the legacy of slavery in the 20th century. Thus, Woodson argued segregation Thus, Woodson argued segregation is the most far-reaching development in the history of the Negro since the enslavement of the race. He concluded, it has been made possible by our system of miseducating innocent people who did not know what was happening. It was so subtle that men have participated in promoting it without knowing they're doing it. Mm, mm. I love I love ketchup though. I love ketchup though. Boy, I'm falling asleep. Hold on, man. Is this the end of the chapter? Okay, we're actually almost close to the end. I'm gonna get to this. We can do it. All right, we can do it. All right, so we read this part about Carter G. Woodson. All right. So, for Woodson, a cultural system based on the power of the white man over Black Americans made historical events such as slave breeding and racial segregation possible. All right. The significance of such a culture, a racist culture, cannot be underestimated in Woodson's analysis. Without its slavery successor, de jure segregation, the legal foundation upon which Jim Crow was built, would not have been possible. The African American sociologist E. Franklin Frazier was all too aware of the link between slavery and segregation, sharing many of the scholarly concerns and interests that Du Bois and Woodson had about the legacies of slavery. Frazier produced some of the most influential and controversial work on the Black family in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. His analysis of Black life and history in the United States came under intense scrutiny during the later half of the 20th century, when newer social and cultural histories of the Black family emphasized the importance of agency among the enslaved. However, in his day, Frazier's work was hailed as a natural history of the Negro family, documented by concrete materials, one that marks the transition from a philosophy of the family as set forth by Westermarck, Muller-Lyer, and Briffault to a study of types of families, in this case within biosocial groups. In other words, Frazier's contemporaries considered his scholarship groundbreaking. Frazier's most enduring scholarly contribution was his argument that the Negro family in the United States was matriarchal. He contended that the matriarchal nature of the Black family was a legacy of enslavement. Generally speaking, Frazier asserted, the mother remained throughout slavery the dominant and important figure in the slave family. Frazier here spoke to the impact that sexual exploitation, including slave breeding, had on African American families during and after slavery. He was, in short, attempting to explain what he viewed as the fragility and, in some cases, malformation of Black families. Frazier therefore attempted to explain the dislocation and instability of Black families from a structural perspective that emphasized the historical and sociological forces that worked against stable Black family units. Focusing on the hypocrisy of the white master class during slavery, Frazier argued that cohabitation of the men of the master race with women of the slave race occurred on every level and became so extensive that it nullified to some extent the monogamous mores. These practices were part of the economic and cultural structure of the slave South that left Black women at the head of unstable single parent families. Frazier's provocative assessment of slavery's impact on marriage and sexual mores among African American people was guided by his belief in the fact of slave breeding. He was, therefore, unequivocal on this issue and in relating it to the long-term consequences for African American families. Apologists for slavery have often denied that Negro women were used for breeding purposes, Frazier wrote, but the evidence is too clear to leave any doubt as to the existence of the practice. Referring to one of his primary sources, a newspaper advertisement from the March 10th, 1796 Charleston City Gazette, Frazier described how the advertisement touted the value of prime slaves, their present owner, with great trouble and expense, selected them out of many for several years past. They were purchased for stock and breeding Negroes and to any planter who particularly wanted them for that purpose. They are a very choice and desirable game. In The Negro in the United States, Frazier continued to maintain that slave breeding was a fact of life in the slave South. Originally published in 1949 and revised and reissued in 1957, the book argued that the increase in the slave population between the founding of the Republic and the outbreak of the Civil War was a product of this practice. Echoing arguments of Du Bois and Woodson on slave breeding, Fraser maintained that the border states became in a sense, the breeding ground for the slave system. The existence of this breeding ground had enduring emotional and material consequences in the form of economic impoverishment, fragile family structures, and a historical counter narrative that was considerably darker than the master narrative that American audiences were exposed to in Hollywood movies. The evidence suggested to Fraser that white slave owners and overseers played an active part in increasing the exportable slave population in the breeding ground of the Upper South. In the decade before the Civil War, Fraser argued the mulatto population increased from 405,000 in 1850 to 588,000 by 1860. According to the perception that slave owners tried to increase the slave population through natural increase, were data that Fraser believed showed an increase in African American mortality in the 2 decades after the Civil War. While numerous factors could account for these statistics, from poverty to ad hoc methods of family planning, the implication is that once slave owners no longer saw social and economic advantages in breeding slaves, every effort was made to ensure infant survival and life expectancy was reduced among the Black populations of the South. In conclusion, the intellectual work of Du Bois, Woodson, and Fraser attacked what most Black scholars saw as the inadequacies of professional historical writing during the early 20th century. White scholars had been blinded by the mythology of lost cause propaganda, employed narrow methodologies that essentially rearticulated the economic rationale of the slave owner and slave trader, and silenced the enslaved and exposed their own racial chauvinism by referring simplistically to the Negro problem in post-Civil War America. African American scholars would have none of this. They believed that the historical and sociological narratives deployed by white academics involved gross historical and sociological generalizations. African American scholars argued that the legacies of slavery were not solely of African Americans' making. For example, Anna Julia Cooper laid at the feet of the United States founding fathers, men she referred to as these jugglers with reason and conscience, the burden of blame for breathing, if only inadvertently, life into slavery. The decisions these men made at the end of the 18th century had profound consequences for generations of enslaved people. Cooper insisted that because white slave owners and slave traders had America's legal structures and economic motives on their side, they began begetting and breeding mongrels of their own flesh among these helpless creatures and pocketing the guilty increase, the price of their own blood in unholy dollars and cents. Once again, it's disgusting when you think about that. Like, people would rape Black women and then sell their own children. Motivated by an unquenchable thirst for wealth and power, the slave owners and slave traders in Cooper's analysis, as in that of W.B. Du Bois, Woodson, and Fraser, used violence and sexual exploitation to profit from Black labor and reproduction. Such historical interpretations, which extended the sensational claims of 19th century abolitionists into the 20th, made for a stark contrast to the lost cause mythology and objective scholarship of white professional historians. But the work of these Black intellectuals was not simply polemical. Their research constituted a forceful scholarly articulation of what millions of Black Americans recalled and spoke about in private. In the decade prior to World War II, Black scholars thus crafted their own interpretation of the role of slave breeding in African American history. At the same time, other segments of Black America began presenting their own versions of this history. In the following chapter, we will see how Black writers and playwrights added to the interpretive layers of African American memory by exploring the violence and sexual exploitation associated with the memory of slave breeding. Their work, performed at community theaters, presented African American audiences with formalized recreations of those memories of slave breeding that Black scholars worked so hard to weave into their analyses and that most white Americans seemed eager to forget. So that was an interesting chapter. We're going to pick up with chapter 4, the theater of memory. I think he's going to be talking about plays that talk about slave breeding. So that should be fascinating. We're going to be reading chapter 4 tomorrow. And I did it. I had to stay awake, man. I just realized how tired I was by reading this book. Not that the book has made me tired, but I've been up all day writing and working and teaching, and I got another class to get to right now. So I'll catch y'all on the flip side. Catch y'all tomorrow. Shout out to Brian C. and shout out to me for being in the chat. And y'all be easy out there. Let me know if there are any other books you want me to read for Book React. Peace.